This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure to speak with Dr. J. Marlena Edwards, Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies and African Studies at Penn State University.
Yep, that's right.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me, Dr. Newby. I'm really excited to do all this.
It is great to have you, and it's great to be able to connect after a little bit of time.
Right. Yeah, because we went to grad school together, so I think this is going to be a really great sort of discourse as Black studies scholars who went through a really similar program and similar training, even though we have different subfields.
Mm-hmm. So, in that vein, how did you get into Black studies?
Well, I'm going to try not to make this a really long story, but I originally got my undergrad degree in sociology, but I was always taking the cross-listed courses in Africana studies. That was my main passion, that I kept being drawn to these courses. And while I was under the sociology track, I'm taking all these really diverse and varied and theoretically dense courses in history, I took a class in human geography. I was taking all of these wonderful fields. And so Black studies to me always appeared to me to be a space of inquiry where you can let your creativity kind of flow, right? You can come from any sort of different theoretical sort of framework. And so when I decided to apply for Ph.D. programs after receiving a master's in history, which I think is a much more confining set of source bases, how you can engage in dialogue, even how you write, even how you engage theories. When I said I wanted to go back to school after about a 4-year break to get a Ph.D., I knew I wanted to go to Black studies programs because I knew I wanted to have a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary and also a disciplinary anarchist type of structure in my education. And I think the program we went through, Michigan State University, was pretty great when it came to that. We were taking classes with political scientists, education scholars, psychiatrists, the whole gamut of different sort of perspectives on Black studies. And so my interest came in really in thinking about the phenomenology of Blackness. How do we understand what it means to be a Black person? And for me, with my subfields in history, over time, what does it look like? How does it change? What remains the same? And just really having an appreciation of the African diaspora as a child of immigrants. I was born in this country, seeing these sort of different cultural interactions, I think deeply imbued my scholarship to really want to study, I want to study Black folk. I want to study everything about us. I want to study the way, we season our food to the way that we interact on the street. So Black studies was the perfect place for that.
So given what got you into it, right, is that the same thing that keeps you committed to the field? Or now that you are in it officially in the academy, are there other things that you have discovered that keep you coming back to Black studies specifically?
It's the students, right? When I first, I started teaching right before the pandemic. So the students, I think probably that's been a discussion that's happened. The students, the way we engage students, our interactions with them were different. But I came across students that just reminded me of the activist work that we were doing when I was in undergrad, 10, 15, almost 20 years behind, and thinking this constant through line was insurgency, the insurgency of Black studies, and the way that it gave students and faculty a home and a space. That is, I think, what continues to bring me back to it, really watching students get into a classroom, they're just whatever, I'm trying to take a course, I'm trying to graduate. And then they get hit with a bit of scholarship that opens up their perspectives about the life around them, the things that they encountered growing up, the interactions they have with their friends, and then wanting and passionately wanting to engage more. That to me is like, if it happens once or twice a semester, I feel like I've done my job, right? But that sort of home space and finding like through this research, you can start to understand self better. Because I know people talk a lot of junk. We're going to be editing, right? People talk a lot of junk about me search as if we don't imbue everything that we do with our own perspectives and our own subjective lenses. And so when I look at students in Black studies grasping for that and reaching that, and it's Black students, but it's also non-Black students who are finding themselves in this work, I'm like, yo, this is representative. This is some good stuff. And it's supposed to be liberatory. So I think that's what keeps coming me back or bringing me back to the space is, it's a home space. Faculty find each other. You find your best friends in these Black study spaces. And then you find these students who their worlds are opened up and you help to facilitate that and hopefully help them go on to do other things with this new knowledge that they have of self and the world.
Thank you. So there are a couple points in there that I want to expand on a little bit. One, you talked about the insurgency of the founding of Black studies, right? And how you saw echoes back to that in other times and spaces. So what about that history is most exciting and informative to your work and your teaching in the space?
It's so funny because as much as like I'm like, yeah, 60s, right? Black studies getting into the academy, like really, I wouldn't even say forcing its way through, but making itself be heard in really loud and key ways that are built on Black powers, built on civil rights. It's built on hundreds of years of legacies of Black life in the United States as folks are in and out, right? There's something really powerful about making that sort of stance because institutions, regardless of what people want to say, don't change that much, right? Institutions are institutions, like they're pillars of society. And to watch a field that is homegrown, that is activist at its core, break through an institution and show not only is this legitimate, but there's other ways of being. Like we don't have to be this one type of pillar, the ivory, what's it called again? The ivory tower.
Ivory tower. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to look like so exclusive. It can be very inclusionary and it can and it should be welcoming to Black peoples. So that is just a radical concept that an institution that in the United States would be broken open by Black radicalism and Black insurgency. And that to me is really just so telling about, I think, just Black resilience. So when I think about all the things that Black people create, I'm also really taken and drawn to the ideas that Black folks came into the academy with a specific set of politics. And they wanted to, it's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's not just creating, okay, we're going to talk about this particular art, but it doesn't have any impact in the world. Black Studies wants us to continue to look at how power works. Black Studies and all of the derivatives that have come from it, or that under the umbrella of Black Studies have pushed so much political discourse today that is, to me, like so fascinating that we can have folks who talk about intersectionality regularly off the top of their heads when it's like, yo, that came from critical race theory, which comes from folks who are deeply engaging in Black studies scholarship. Like we're using these terms very just every day and also incorrectly, but we're using them all because scholars saw that Black people have a voice and a thing to say, and that our unique perspectives on the world can help shape scholarship and help how we see these power dynamics. So that to me is like absolutely just incredible. It like brings me, you could probably hear it, like smiles, because I go, wow, this wasn't supposed, this wasn't supposed to happen, right? If we think about disposability, if we do have a critical race perspective, after slavery, the sort of use of Black persons, right, who are imported for this particular type of labor is, it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And we see the history of what do we do, and it's violent. And instead, right, what we see is, I don't want to call it like a swagger, right? But it's this resilience of Black persons to come into this space and shape and alter the academy, which then, of course, the academy has its political sort of facets and everything. Like we often just go, oh, I go to college. These are the change makers. These are the idea makers. These are the people who, talk to presidents and talk to other sort of political leaders. And Black studies creating these theories is now in the ears of the world's greatest thinkers, as well as the people who have a lot of that power to do something with it. And so that history is really important, but also the history that predates the 60s, right? We see Black folk were always pushing to not only ensure that Black persons had, their histories known, but that their history is known by lots of other people, right? Going back to Carter G. Woodson, right? Thinking like, okay, well, we need to make a journal. We need to make a week that celebrates Black accomplishments. So every time people say, oh, we don't need a Black History Month, I'm like, imagine a time where you were told being a Black person meant you were nothing. And now I'm like, a month? It's Black History Year. Like, you can't divorce the building of the United States, this hemisphere, without talking about the contributions of Black people. So that insurgency to get into the academy, while comes at, we're talking like 1915, but really in the 60s and then the 80s when we have Ph.D. programs, is a history of resilience. And so as much as I call it insurgent, there's just a long continuous thread of these particular type of actions that have been slowly eroding the status quo. But the status quo is strong. It is strong, but
Yes.
but it's really impressive to think these leaps and bounds, especially of people who we were told, and I'm sure we were told this growing up, that Black people didn't really have history. Black people didn't really create anything, right? And then we know that's not true. We knew that wasn't true instinctively. And to see that is something that is now and readily replicated and demonstrated in the academy, which is where the greatest minds in the world are supposed to be, or at least the ones that the institution has high-fived, right? That said, you belong. There's something really powerful about that. And I think that also, speaking to the question before, it keeps me going, that this is much larger than just saying you got a degree.
Thank you. That was inspiring, and like that reflection on like this long trajectory, and putting yourself and all of us at this point in Black studies in that long trajectory is a really important reminder of like everything, that the connections and this unbroken chain of methodologies and scholarship and community work and all of the things that go into it. It's like when we talk about like the civil rights movement, when it's conceptualized as like this 10-year block of time, when in reality we need to think way back. The long trajectory,
this trajectory. It's like time is not real. Once you start looking at these lineages, you go, I can't, like, periodizing anything is difficult when you're like, there is a long history of this. And yes, it's the long Black freedom movement, right? We can just look at it like that and go, here are those dots on that line. Like, here is where you see civil rights. This is where you see Black power. This is where, for my research, you see Black immigrants coming in and how that shapes the sort of the discourse around African America, the way that shapes, the trajectories that we have today, right? They're all in conversation with each other, because as diaspora people, that we see ourselves as like, oh, we have a shared destiny, and we also have shared experiences. So how do we use those experiences to reshape narratives? And that's dope. That's like just such an incredible. Yeah, I'm excited. Like, you got me excited again. Like, oh yeah, I can't wait to go back to teaching in the fall.
So speaking of teaching,
Right.
one of the things that I personally am interested in, just because not only of my specialization, but because I have a lot to do with curricula in my current role, what we do in the classroom is a question that I have for people, right? Like, what do we do in a Black Studies classroom? And does what we do in a Black Studies classroom, does it look different than what happens in like a sociology classroom or a psychology classroom? And should it look different, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but should it look different than other classroom spaces do?
It's a great question. And it's one that I think about quite often, as many of your, guests have probably stated. Like, most of us are in multiple fields, right? We're not, most of us aren't just housed in Black studies. And that's perhaps another discussion about like why that happens. But oftentimes we're either cross-listing our courses, or we're told you need to teach strictly, for me, history. And then here's this AFAM class that also might be cross-listed with something like geography, or, in my case, anthropology, where I'm like, I don't do. I said I could try. And so I often, and even when I was writing my dissertation, I was like, how are we making sure that this is a Black studies project? And Black studies is not just, okay, I study Black people. Like, and I think that is always the part where we gets a little spicy in sort of discussions, especially when you come to curricula. And I think Black studies classes are going to look different than I've taught straight history classes, where it's like straight lecture, 100-something students. So far, I have not had a Black studies course that has had 100 students. 40, right? 40 students, and also, again, cross-listed, right? 40 students, but never 100 students. And so my interactions with students tend to be the things that I think drew me into wanting to join the academy in the first place. It's one-on-one. Like, my students, I think at the end of class, get to know who I am as a person. And I want to bring in as much multidisciplinary things as possible. Yes, I know my secondary field is history. So I'm going to want to bring in primary sources. I'm going to want to bring those things in. But I also want to make sure I bring in primary sources that aren't necessarily from a colonial perspective, but from the people who actually lived it, right? How do we look at both of these, like, let's say, primary source documents? One is written by, the Spanish conquistadors, right? And talking about enslaving people, or even the Portuguese, right? And then what do we think about African responses to that? So I want my students to see that there's multiple ways to look at a particular moment in history, but also I want my students to be creative. I say one of the most creative things you can do as a historian is primary source analysis. It is let your imagination run fully wild, right? Within bounds, right? Fully within bounds. And I feel the same thing about the ways we need to theorize around Blackness, right? Black concepts, Black thoughts. How do my students start to use their creative minds, also use their own lived experiences, and think about oral history as as a method that we use, that sometimes people don't, I think is as reliable. But there's something, again, about this lineage, right? This lineage of knowledge that's been passed on. How are we then imbuing our own research lenses, our own eyes with that? And so I've done stuff in the classroom like, we're going to do podcasts. And I had my students, this was like, I think one of my the favorite projects I did was I taught a Black women's history course, and I wanted my students to create, they had to have 2 different assignments, but it was also March 2020. So it was also spring 2020. So some of those things got a little shelved, but at least we got this podcast done where they pick up on a notion, right? So one group picked up on Black maternal mortality, but they also started picking up on the ways that Black people have escaped, and I put that in quotes so you can't see it, escape the opioid crisis. And there's those things are tied together, right? This sort of medical field looking at Black bodies as, we don't feel pain. You don't need opioids. We're going to prescribe you less, but then also looking at Black women's mortality. And so like maternal mortality. So they made this beautiful, and I mean beautiful in the sense of sophisticated, articulate, well-researched podcast connecting this history of like early gynecology all the way until they even included a clip from Wanda Sykes where she said she had a hysterectomy and they only gave her like Tylenol. Like they made this long arc. And just thinking about how my students were able to, and this is, of course, I'm facilitating, but they're pulling these sources together. They're pulling pop culture sources. They're pulling things from, readings that they had in class, as well as primary sources, newspapers, and they're creating a pretty compelling narrative. Like they were, and not only were they shocked at what they came up with, they all then decided to post the oral account, so the actual audio on their LinkedIn pages. They sent it to their families. They wanted their it was such a powerful experiment that I was just like, I'm trying this out in class. I don't know how to do no podcast. I don't know technology. I didn't have to do this, right? Like I didn't have that kind of training. We watched videos, we talked about stuff, we read quite a bit, right? But how do we engage what you're reading with actual life? And that's the Black Studies difference between the sociology classes I was taking. What is the real life application of this? And why is that important? That's not what you're going to get in history. History is going to tell you what happened in the past. And my mind is always, and how does that affect today? How are these things constantly in conversation with each other? And that podcast, I think, was a brilliant way of showing like, wow, they get it. And they're able to apply Black studies, the lens of it, and the research perspectives to everyday living. And so, yeah, we got to be different because our work is forward thinking. It's always forward thinking and always, it's Sankofa, right? It's always looking forward and backwards. And it's making sure that it's an unbroken line and that we see it. Because the ways that they don't want us to see, whoever they is, right? The way that I think we, as society, have been made to think of things as truncated pieces of history versus an unbroken line in, let's say, the Black freedom struggle. Black Studies allows us to say, yeah, actually, there's a trend here. And we can see this in 1831. We can see it in 1916. We can look at the language. We can talk about presidential language and then go, oh yeah, Octavia Butler, who may not have considered herself a Black Studies scholar, but all of her work was rooted in the lens of particularly Black women, right? Black women's lives. She presaged this for us too, right? There's nothing, she said, there's nothing new under the suns, but there are new suns, right? And I think that that's like the way that Black Studies has to be different. We have to look at things differently, and we have to make sure that I think it's an applied science more than it's just like an arts or like a liberal arts. It's an applied science, and it needs to be applied regularly. It helps with critical thinking. That was a long answer.
No, that was a great answer. And I think that the reflection that Black Studies is an applied science is really important, particularly in this moment, right? If we think about the importance of reinforcing for our students and for ourselves that lineage and that unbroken line, and making sure that the connections are being not just acknowledged, but studied, is really important right now.
Yeah.
With all of the things that are happening. Because there isn't anything new under the sun, but it can feel like that if you don't have that lens to help you to see where things have happened in the past and how people have gotten through those things in the past, which will probably be very important as we move forward.
Yes, absolutely. The concept around communal living has been it's been a huge discussion. Like I've just been seeing it more and more on social media. And then amongst my friends, like, we are not meant to be living these, like, that's like uncommon in human history, period. But in the modern era, like, how do we then support each other in these sort of community ways, right? And folks are talking about Black nationalism, right? They're talking about, like, how do we see ourselves as one people and then treat ourselves in those sort of ways? And so, yeah, absolutely, 100% that how do we look at the solutions of the past and say, yes, well, that's the past, and here's other context that we need to, but this is a very good blueprint. This is a very good building block that we can settle some other things on top of, and hopefully the next generation comes behind and can build on top of that so that it strengthens versus getting lost to time.
Absolutely. So in thinking about all of that, but in the difference of a Black Studies classroom and an applied Black Studies lens to scholarship and teaching, but also just to life in a lot of ways. Being someone who does have both degrees in history and like that being your specialization, how do you situate yourself in relationship to the field of history?
It's a question of time, right? Like, I mean, it's the question of my time of my life. It was a question that came up when I was completing my dissertation. I think I mentioned that a few minutes ago, that I felt like I got so deeply into the history methodology that I had forgotten, like, and I'm like, yeah, I'm studying Black people, but I had forgotten the insurgent nature, the activist nature, that this is not, like, of course, I believe that you should have scholarship that could be whatever you want it to be. It does not have to be towards the end of, proving everyone wrong. It doesn't have to have a vindicationist sort of thrust, right? It can't just exist and be pretty good. But I'm looking at mine and saying, my work is in the tradition of vindication, but it's also in a tradition of what? That's corrective, descriptive, and prescriptive, right? If I'm thinking about Manning Marable, Alan Cologne, like that sort of, those sort of progenitors of the field who are saying, these are the ways that Black studies is. How is my work corrective? Okay. That is not a principle that you have in history. History wants to demonstrate there's other ways of looking at things. Sure. There's other histories overlap. Yes. It's also very descriptive, but the prescriptive element is what really then launches this into a new sort of dynamic, right? If you think about NCBS's thrust about social responsibility and academic excellence, those two things have always been tied. And so as a person who works in a history department, as well as works in our African American studies / Black studies / Africana studies, those departments, the way that I have been, I don't want to even call it struggling, the way that I have made sure and ensured that I'm still very much so keeping true to my own identity as a Black studies scholar, right? That's the thing I put out first. I'm a Black studies scholar who uses history as a lens, is because of this prescriptive element. And I want to make sure, if that's in working in the many sort of service obligations that you have in the academy, for me, that's like, all right, how do I make sure that we have this, the sort of buzzword anti-racism based training that has to do with, like, well, as historians, we have to be activists. I just actually found a note that, I'm going to just pick it up, a note that I had from a past lecture where it said, having a PhD gives us a platform to educate. It's not just sitting up in the tower and having coffee and, our elbow patches, which is all very good. We all want that, our elbow patches. But it actually is about a platform to educate. And whether that's public education, like you are educating the masses, you are being out there writing things for people to engage publicly, or that's the work that you do on the micro level, or that's the work you do in the community interacting with people. That's the way that I really want to make sure that Black studies is still at the forefront of the work that I do, even as my primary field at my current institution is in history. I'm still like, this comes from an activist position. I'm never not going to circle us back to what is the point of the work that we're doing and how is it impacting our communities. Now, the greater challenge is, and this is one that a colleague and I talk about quite regularly, is what does it mean to work in a Black Studies department in a city or town that does not have that many Black people, or does not have a discernible community of Black people that are not students. So they're not transient in that sort of way. So that has been a major discussion, is, so how do we make Black studies still do this prescriptive element in a space where there are very few of us? And that has been the topic that has been going on for quite a few years. So it is something I'm still thinking about, but in my everyday, okay, I'm a historian, I come do my historian work. How is this prescriptive? What's the next thing that we're doing that's pushing this beyond just being something you read about, but something that makes you rethink about the world around you, really in a critical way?
That was really interesting. And I hadn't thought, like, that question of, like, doing Black studies in a space that doesn't necessarily have a critical mass of Black people is really interesting. And one that definitely, I'm sure that's like, obviously I don't have any answers, but that is an interesting thing, especially given the attacks on Black studies in a lot of places that don't have critical masses of Black people, in places that do, but don't necessarily have the political power to combat it in the same ways. That's an interesting one. That's something that
the ages, because we look at this, the prize, right? If you're in the academy, many of us were taught very early on, the prize is these top schools that are R1 institutions that are the best of the best. And then, you do a little Google on like all those schools, where are they? And what kind of relationship do they have to the communities? As we see through a lot of hearings, as well as exploratory sort of research groups, not very good relationship with the community, displacement of Black and brown people, but also places that have used Black labor for many of those beautiful structures you like to look at, because that's some of the best stuff about working university, is the campus architecture. And then you go, oh, who built this?
Yeah.
Who built? And then you start looking at yourself like, okay, well, what is my role? And I don't know if you saw that movie Master with Regina Hall.
Yes.
The line that keeps ringing to me often is where she's like at the end, spoiler alert, she goes, I'm not the master, I'm the maid. And I think often of the ways these attacks in Black studies have also shifted administrative engagement in Black studies that has allowed for Black studies and other ethnic studies fields, gender studies, to become more service oriented. Right? Your students aren't really necessarily majors anymore. You're brilliant students who love this. They're not majoring. They're in there because they find home, but they can't fit it necessarily in their schedule to make it a major. So you end up being a service department. You end up having maybe 10 graduates, maybe 20 graduates a year, but hundreds of students who have passed through the doors.
Yeah, and who have taken multiple classes. But the majoring part, you do that.
Major, minor, and that line, I mean, I did not necessarily love that movie, but that line sticks to me when I think about, so what is the contemporary role of Black studies today in 68, 69, 70, 88, right? We see this sort of like the institutional push. Like the institutions were pushed by local activists. They're pushed by their students. They're pushed by their faculty to engage this. And as we see these attacks, there is less interest in fighting these battles to keep a service department going. And so the question of the ages, apologies if you hear that, the question of the ages is, okay, well, what is the role of Black studies in the contemporary moment? And how do we transition it from the maid, right? Like the one who gives Black students and other students who feel marginalized a home, gives faculty a home, gives students the critical analysis that they need to navigate this contemporary world, but that's not being funded in the same way as other departments are. And then, the sort of rationale for that is you don't have
major.
It's like, so how do we get back here? Like, we don't have majors because, there's not an effort from this institution or that institution to combat these very top-down and, sometimes billionaire-led initiatives to dismantle them. Like, if we have to again go back to what institutions are, and they don't change much. But you have these insurgent departments and these insurgent programs that are calling for those kind of changes. And at this moment, it's, I wouldn't say rougher than before, but again, like you said, what things can we learn from the past?
Yeah. Those are, all of that is so important. And thinking about not just, understanding the reality of the service aspect. Because we do have, my department is small. We teach a lot of students, a lot of gen ed courses. But that does not translate to the amount of majors, right? And so and especially within this current moment in society, outside of everything else that's going on, we're very much connected, is this idea that social science and humanities are not viable career paths. And so this idea that you can't, majoring in something like African American studies is not necessarily going to get you the type of income that you need to survive.
Who's surviving?
Well, that is the question.
I get really fascinated when people say that, because I remember getting my master's in history and, wanting a job. Was like, I'm leaving the academy. It's too hard, right? Like all these sort of things. 4 years later, I went back as if I forgot. And I remember people at interviews being like, well, you have a master's in history. What is that going to get you? I'm like, you have a bachelor's in English, bro. You're interviewing me. You're the executive director. Like, you shouldn't even be asking me that question. You should see that skills aren't necessarily tied to the degrees in your interest. That there's a lot more to college education, institutionally, than this leading to a job. And there's been a narrative shift that has been probably happening since the institution of Black studies, women, gender, sexuality studies, ethnic studies broadly, that has said, no, you need to go to college for a job, right? Versus being the intellectual elite. But I'm like, you talking about we can't get jobs? Ask Mae Jemison, who has a degree in African American studies. Ask Issa Rae. Like, there are people, I'm just like, Issa Rae is doing so well in this life. And I'm like, you can't disaggregate that from getting a service degree at post-service, right? You can't disaggregate. Okay, I'm not gonna go in about Mae Jemison being, I'm an absolute fan, right? But you can't, the logics don't actually add up.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to do with that? What were you going to do with what are you going to, it's not about necessarily the degree, right? We know that from the world of influencers, we know it's not the degree, right? It's how do you apply the skill? How do you find your market? How do you find your niche? And this sort of way is like, well, you can't get a job in this. The only job you can get is being a professor. I'm like, well, that's not a bad job. So it's like, it's also not a bad job. But your college degree is not necessarily the only avenue that you have to get decent, well-paying employment.
Mm-hmm.
There's plenty of people I know who are software engineers who have degrees in English who have just made the transition because that's a skill they can teach themselves. There's plenty of chefs there's chefs with Black Studies degrees who imbue their work with how to taste it. Like, there's so many different outlets for it. Like, if you can go from being like in space to saying, okay, I'm also going to cook a meal inspired by this knowledge, honey, like the possibilities, again, in an insurgent field are endless. I mean, within the parameters of modern society, but they are endless in the sense, right? It's not the degree that necessarily positions you for the job. It can help, but it can't, it might not hurt. Like, go for it. Become majors.
Yes. And like you said, that lens that Black Studies gives you, that's applicable across everything. That is not a lens that just allows you to look at one set of questions or one set of sources or one specific time period. It's a lens that allows you to understand things in relationship to each other and in a trajectory that other places, other fields, and other degrees might not prepare you to do.
Right. How many people are taking courses in, I'm going to beat on history again, who are also getting classes from religious scholars? Like, like you're in this class, your professor is a historian who was trained in historical method, who maybe took some classes outside of that field in order to do this, but probably didn't. It was like, just was a historian. Whereas in Black Studies, you're taking classes with historians. You're taking classes, or people who are trained in history or see themselves as historians. You're taking classes with religious education scholars, curriculum. Like, you're taking the variety of courses, which will blow your mind. The thing that really pushed me into ended up becoming a sociology major, because I was pre-veterinary science with not at a school that had veterinary school attached, but I was young, was taking class and finding out about the cost of antiretroviral drugs for HIV and the way that pharmaceutical companies jack up those prices.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing that science wasn't neutral changed my life. I would not be here if I did not take that class. It was cross-listed. Again, it was an AFAM course. I took it as an AFAM course that had sociology. And I said, this is mind-blowing. Changed the trajectory of my life. Absolutely did.
That's so important. Because that point, like, you took a class and it changed everything. And I think that that's so much of the possibility and promise that Black Studies does have, right? To show, to illuminate, to put a spotlight on these things that too often are just taken for granted.
Absolutely.
Like, why are these drugs cost prohibitive for the people that need them? Purposefully and intentionally so.
Purposefully and intentionally so, as my uncle died from complications of HIV. My aunt had HIV, right? I'm sitting here like, it's like listening to 1619 Project, right? You're listening and hearing about like this sort of the medical field and African Americans, and then you're like, that's me too.
Mm-hmm.
That's my family in Guyana that is going through this thing that American pharmaceutical companies are driving. Maybe my uncle didn't have to die. Maybe my uncle could have lived had he had access to medicine that was life-changing and not just hoarded by the West or the United States West. So yeah, it's critical and important because it can reflect your entire life. It changed me, completely changed me. That's like almost 20 years ago. And I'm still thinking about that point.
Yeah. Like, that was definitely me going into Black Studies was definitely also the result of a class that I took, because I didn't know that Black Studies was a thing, right? Like, I was raised with Black books and Black history, and my mother was very intentional about us having books by Black people and us reading Baldwin and Morrison and all of that. But like, that was knowledge that we gained at home. I didn't realize that like you could go in, I could make a whole career out of knowledge about and for Black people. So that class, like,
I love that. I didn't know I could make a whole career out of knowledge for and about Black people. Like, for and about, my goodness. Like that's a big thing. Like, the fact that we knew we could be English majors, we knew we could be psychology. I remember that in high school. I remember they had all these people, who do you want to be? And I was like, I'm going to be a psychologist, an animal psychologist. I don't know what I was thinking. I just don't know what I was going to do with that. Black Studies wasn't there.
No. I was going to be a lawyer. I'm supposed to be somebody's lawyer right now.
I'm supposed to probably be patching up some animal right now, right? Like, which, yay, we still have doctorates, right? We're very smart people, right? We're people who have grit and determination and are like but we've chosen a different path. And I think one that invigorates our lives, right? Mm-hmm. What is it? They said after 6 years, most lawyers kind of leave the law profession. Bet you Black Studies is not the same. I bet you it's for life.
Listen, because it's already been more than 6 years. I'll say that.
Right? Yeah, it's been a time.
Yes, and there's been a lot that happened in that time.
Yeah,
but not once during all that's happened has my solution been to leave Black Studies.
Yeah. How do I make Black Studies work in every space that I'm in, right? Mm-hmm. You go to Uncle Bobby's in Philadelphia and you go, okay, this is a Black Studies space. Like, you walk in, like, there's books, there's lectures, you're like, and I'm gonna get coffee, and I'm gonna get a little croissant, right? And a few blocks down, you have a hoodoo shop, like, opened up by Chantrell P. Lewis, and you're just like, oh, Black Studies is happening here. Like, it is happening even in retail. It's happening in coffee. It's happening with, your neighbors across the street. It's happening in all those. I'm not leaving it because it's me. It's for me, and it's for, like, it's something I can do. That's powerful. That is powerful. I mean, I'm happy for us.
Me too.
I'm really happy for us.
And it's important to be able to be happy in the midst of everything else, which is something else that Black Studies shows us.
Yeah.
Right? The joy in the midst. Whatever the midst is at the time, there is always an element of joy and the ability to find that regardless of the situation or circumstance that is happening outside.
It's really impressive. I was saying to a friend, I was like, a lot of us don't look like what we've been through. And you could think about that as Black life, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the sort of finding this joy, finding the ability to laugh in the midst of slavery, right? In the midst of, like, that's no joke. And yet music is created, styles are created, food is created, like, yes, out of circumstances that are like exigent. You have to make these things happen, but then not for those things just to happen and just be moments of survival, but they become spaces of thrival. Like, there's way too much that's been banked on Black folks' style and ability to find joy and like replicate that outward. Mm-hmm. It's like, to be anti-capitalist, there's way too much money in that. Like, streetwear. I just sit there and go, streetwear. My goodness. Like, that you buy that anywhere now.
Yeah.
And that's the creative technologies of Black life in urban spaces. has created streetwear that is arguably the probably most popular fashion trends to date, right? It is becoming, it's ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm. And then it will be copied and renamed in the latest trend for the fall season.
And then guess what? Black people are creating something else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just right now I'm wondering, I said, what's the new thing? I said, is it already happening? Did I miss it? Like, am I just too old to see it? Like, am I just at that place where I'm like, I'm not on the trend? But it's obviously, just if we look at history, whatever the newest trend is already happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently already happening, and it's going to be amazing. And it's going to come from a Black person just being allowed to have a moment to think, a moment to create. And that moment is going to skyrocket. And I'm looking forward to the new thing. I'm like, what's the new music? Like, what is the new music trend that's going to come out in the next few years? I don't know. We went from gospel to blues to hip hop to what is it? Where is it? Let's go. I'm ready. I'm absolutely ready.
It'll definitely be interesting and fun, because it's always fun.
It's always fun. And that's that joy part that you're talking about. Like, that joy is, and it's, they're not talking about happiness. We're not talking about contentment. We're talking about like an internal light that is keeping folks alive. And that's big. That's big things. That's big revolutionary work. That's stuff that I think you're allowed to see, critically allowed to see structurally through Black studies. This didn't just happen. And I just think it's a beautiful thing. So that's what I say. I'm happy for us. I'm happy that we were around in a time that not only is Black studies institutionalized, but popularized. Like, you could get a degree in this and then be whoever you want. And that we're around to fight for it based on our joy, based on, I took a class 20 years in, I'm not letting this go. I'm going to find every single way to put this in my life. Every way. From the way that I dress, my hair, the style of my home, to the way I interact with people on the street. You have to know it comes from a deep joy place that has been relit continuously by my study.
So I do want to be respectful of your time. I know it's summer, and I definitely appreciate people taking time out of their limited amount of vacation and downtime to talk with me. As you said before we started, the semester is quickly approaching once again.
Full speed.
Yeah. So, which I feel like this was kind of already addressed, but I want to give you opportunity to elaborate further if you would like to, about like what excites you most about the future of Black studies.
I think I'm really excited to see, we talk about push comes to shove, right? Like, push comes to shove, somehow oxtail is now an internationally delicious cuisine that you can't just, the way oxtail is expensive these days, right? But push came to shove, it created this sort of thing from, this longer history from enslavement to now. I'm really curious to see what Black studies will be after these attacks. Because Black studies is going nowhere. Because like I said, that light that's been reignited in us continuously by our study, by seeing our students grow and thrive, and you send us emails later and be like, yeah, you be an important professor to me. And I'm like, really? What? Of course I was, right? But at the same time, I'm really excited to see what new things we create as a response to it. And I'm really interested and hopeful that we can shift the current way it's going, the service departments, the service fields, into become majors with us. We need you, electrical engineer, to also have a degree in Black Studies so that you can, or you person who does work in AI, right? Or with those things, the digital card readers, like that can, I don't want to be surveilled, but I do want to be recognized when I'm washing my hands, right? Like I do want you to recognize darker skin. I do want to see Black people who study Black studies getting into the medical field and then being like, hey, these reproductive issues that we're seeing, right, as we look at how relaxers are now horrible for women's reproduction. Side note, we're not talking about it, but that is because more and more of us have been in those spaces. So I'm looking forward for us transitioning from service to, not master, right? But service to the actual space where students go, no, this home is important for me to nurture and cultivate. And I want to take this home with me in all these other respective fields. We don't have to be professors. There's actually not that many professors in the world, but we can all take the skill sets that we learn and put them in other places. I want to keep seeing that. I want to see who we become. I want to see the dense, amazing theories that come out of this time of tribulation, and then see like, yo, we told you, right?
Mhm.
I told you. Carter G. Woodson told you. Like there's a lot going on, and we are building on it. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to see that and seeing maybe not programs shutting down, but programs being fully funded and supported by their institutions. Fully funded, because you can't just sit there and love our diversity and racially, right? And love our diverse perspectives, but then not give us the tools that we need to serve. I'm ready for the clock to keep to turn again to like, yes, support. Yes, seeing the viability. Yes, and knowing it's important and not bowing down to the pressures. So I'm looking forward to that all. Again, that's nothing new under the sun. I'm looking forward to what was and what will be, because we've already seen it before. So I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. That was
Happy.
so great. I really enjoyed being able to talk with you today and just catch up in general. Before we get out of here, I do want to just mention your upcoming book.
Right. Yeah. So I'm writing my first book, and if you don't know, titles change. But the tentative title is Oceans Away from My Soul, and it's looking at West Indian and Cape Verdean immigrants and their community building strategies in New Bedford, Massachusetts between 1870 and 1970. And this is kind of a long history of ensuring that when we talk about Black life, we're also talking about its multi-ethnic sort of functions, right? African America is not this like one solid, uninterrupted from 1619. It has always been interacting with the diaspora and interacting with other Black folks in the hemisphere. And so my project is looking at whaling ships as a modality of migration. And, something that we don't often think about ever, right? Ever. But thinking about those creative technologies that Black folks had in turning a ship, which we generally think of in pretty negative terms, into a site of opportunity. And then the communities that they created in like New Bedford, Massachusetts, and we could use Providence. There's plenty of other places we could use as well. And that's like the new sort of project that's should be coming out. I'm busy and happily working on it every day so that this can be out in the world. And as well as the families that I interviewed, they get to see an accurate representation of the contributions of their ancestors being in print. And being in print is not, again, it's that edifying stuff. That's not something that time can wash away. So that's motivating for me, is getting that out, particularly for them. And also writing my first book. That's exciting.
That is exciting. Well, I'm very much looking forward to when that comes out.
Thank you.
And thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah.
Greatly appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the rest of your summer.
Yeah, you too.